Thank you. Thank you, Mary, and it's a delight to be here on a Saturday morning in the middle of possibly one of the most listless, soulless and dreary general election campaigns I can ever remember. So the title of our session, your session, What Do We Do About Our Democracy, is very, very timely. And I will, in the short time available to me, try and explain to you the three principal crises in our democratic system as I see them, and then three possible suggestions about how we can remedy those problems. So first and foremost, I think it is important to be very unblinking and very candid in quite how stuck and paralysed British democracy has now become. Let me put it this way. Any democratic system relies, above and beyond everything else, on those in power constantly looking over their shoulder, worried that someone else is going to take power away from them. Without competition, democracy is nothing. Without the pendulum swing of electoral contests in which one lot win one election and another lot win the next, democracy is not worthy of the name. And that is what has happened in our country. It is very important to understand that there is no single party now in British politics, not a single party in British politics, who now on their own can wrest power away from the Conservative Party. It's not a conspiracy. It's a set of, perhaps, of accidents. The dominance in Scottish politics by the Scottish Nationalist Party has kneecapped the Labour Party. The electoral system flatters the Conservatives. They've got this cabal of vested interests in the right-wing press who sort of clear their way for them. Whatever the reasons, the outcome is remorselessly the same. The pendulum of British democracy has just got stuck. No single party can now compete for power with the present incumbents in number 10. So that's the first crisis, that the ebb and flow of democratic life in this politics has been arrested. And I sometimes think it is important to be more candid and blunt in spelling that out. Secondly, and partly related to that, we have a system which has become very vulnerable to the influence of vested interests, moneyed elites, and unaccountable individuals and organisations who are able to use the peculiarities of our democratic system, the absence of formal checks and balances which generally prevent vested interests and moneyed elites from hollowing out politics in other systems. We don't have a written constitution. We don't have meaningful checks and balances in Parliament. We have an electoral system which gives extraordinary centralised power on a minority of the popular vote. The outgoing government, Theresa May's government, got, barely 24% of the eligible vote at the last general election. And so, for all of those reasons, we are now, in my view, seeing an encroachment by way of kind of proxy and unaccountable influence of a new Brexit elite who are operating almost like the new kind of puppet masters of British politics, and are doing so in a way which is entirely unaccountable, much of it is invisible, and almost all of it is entirely unknown to the British public. So if you look at the financing of the Brexit campaign, it is very, very striking that some of the richest individuals in this country, almost all of them, to a man, I was about to say to a man and a woman, it's almost all, curiously, men, some exceptions, but almost all of them are men who are working in one shape or form in finance, in one sector of the British economy. Folk like Peter Hargreaves, Jeremy Hosking, Michael Hintzer, Stuart Wheeler, Paul Marshall, etc. All of them may individually be decent individuals, but they have acted, knowingly or otherwise, in an unusually coordinated fashion to mobilize very significant amounts of money derived from one particular sector in pursuit of one particular ideological objective, which is not only to remove the United Kingdom from the European Union, but crucially, if you read the musings and outpourings of these individuals, they're all united, if from somewhat different directions, by a hardline libertarian small state view of the world, that we need to move as a country in order to regain our economic virility, that we need to pursue a sort of small state, offshore, what's so-called Singapore-style low-regulation economy. You see it in the media. The competitors, or the folk who used to act as competitors, some of the principal newspaper owners in this country, the Barclay brothers, Rupert Murdoch. He's not an owner, but he's clearly a power in his own right. The somewhat sort of curdled and zany prejudices of Paul Dacre in the Daily Mail. These, again, they're all men, they're all older men. These men used to be competitors. But Brexit has curiously acted as a glue to turn them from competitors into a cabal. And they've created this sort of Praetorian guard around the Brexit cause and around Theresa May, who is now, in a sense, their perfect Prime Minister. They have her exactly where they want them. She will do exactly what they instruct. And they've transformed themselves from vigorous competitors into a cabal that kneecaps any opposition to Brexit, discredits and delegitimizes, whether it's the Governor of the Bank of England, whether it's judges, whether it's me, whether it's you, whether it's the young, whether it's pro-European businesses. Anyone who speaks now against the trajectory that they want is treated in a coordinated fashion. This is the difference from previous years, in a coordinated fashion to an industrial scale attack. And then you have, as you will have read in certain newspapers, increasing evidence that some of the campaign organizations, particularly those that mobilized a lot of the data that was used in the referendum last year, were funded and organized by Trump supporters from the other side of the Atlantic. Robert Mercer, in particular, seems to have played, one of the founders of Breitbart, seems to have played an important role. And so my point is this, is that we have a democratic culture and a system which is not only stuck, it doesn't work anymore, it's not moving, it's also very susceptible and vulnerable to takeover by unaccountable elites. And I think that's one of the curious things about the Brexit revolution. If you look at the eruptions of populism in other countries, if you look at the support for Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Le Pen in France, they were, whether we like it or not, in many ways an eruption of and a groundswell of grassroots opinion and dissatisfaction, entirely understandable dissatisfaction with the status quo. What is curious in the United Kingdom is that we've seen the kind of victory of one part of our commercial and media elite getting one over on another part of the elite. It's a curiously British elitist revolution, and we need to understand what it is. And the third and final thing is, of course, and I read in the papers yesterday that Ian McEwan spoke beautifully, as he, of course, would do, on this very subject. We have a political system which is almost designed to ignore and overlook the aspirations and the needs and the dreams of the young. So we have a democracy which is no longer a democracy in the functioning sense of the word, one which is very susceptible to elite takeover, and one which is willfully making very big and radical decisions about the future, whilst then deliberately, perhaps not quite deliberately, but certainly systematically, ignoring the wishes of the very people who have to inhabit that future, namely the young. So what do we finally, in a minute and a half, do about that? The first thing is this. You cannot restore the genius, the elixir, the necessity of competition to the British democratic system without non-conservative and anti-Brexit forces working more effectively together. I'm not, by the way, before some... But before some mole from Conservative central offices, coalition of chaos, I'm not talking about any party propping up Theresa May in number 10 or propping up Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about after the general election. For those, and by the way, I hope this would weigh on the minds not just of Remain voters, not just of progressive voters, but all voters who care about the quality of British democracy. An opposition-less democracy is rotten. And we have now the very real prospect of a one-party state in Scotland, north of the border, a one-party state in England, in Westminster, and of course the SNP and the Conservatives are ideal foils for each other. They are ideal foils for each other. The SNP can blame everything on those dastardly Conservatives in Westminster, and Conservatives in Westminster can blame everything on those terrifying SNP hordes about to flow over Hadrian's Wall. And they did that, by the way, to devastating effect at the last election 2 years ago. For any of us who don't feel that either of those options are the kind of future that we want, of Scottish nationalism on the one hand, and an increasingly angry UKIP-light English nationalism in the hands of the Conservative Party, it's not a choice. We are duty-bound to work together. And it has to, for those of you who are in the Labour Party, it has to start in the Labour Party. The Labour Party must understand, and I say this, and I say this as someone who, you might expect, is entitled to a little schadenfreude about the travails and ills of the Labour Party, having been traduced by them quite so vigorously over half a decade. But I'm not. I'm really, really sad that a once great party of social progress, of internationalism, and of government has now become, in my view, such a spectacularly introverted and self-indulgent political movement. And the Labour Party can help renew, or people within it can help renew the progressive cause, but only if they understand what I think many of them get in their heads but don't yet feel in their hearts, is that they are not capable. It is impossible under our electoral system. It is impossible against the vested interests that I talked about. It is impossible because of the turn in Scottish politics for Labour to win again. So Labour must learn pluralism. If it does that, there is hope. If it doesn't, there is no hope. Secondly, as part of that reinvention of progressive pluralist politics, we must put the inevitably, often rather arcane issues surrounding political reform, electoral reform, House of Lords reform, party funding reform, which of course I totally understand may fascinate those of us gathered here, but bore the vast majority of the British people. We must put that centre ground, because unless you clean up the way and make more transparent the way parties are funded, unless you ensure that people can't simply march into Downing Street with barely a quarter of the eligible vote, until you open up this increasingly sour and curdled and unhealthy relationship between the media and political elites in this country, we will continue to make the same mistakes that we have made over and over again in recent years. So political reform, as well as the reorganisation and realignment of the non-conservative spectrum of centre ground and progressive ground in British politics, is a second vital ingredient to the rebirth of our somewhat tarnished and jaundiced and jaded political system. And third and finally, and I won't say very much on this, not least because I'm not perhaps the best witness to talk about the needs of young voters, having somewhat blotted my copybook with them in the last Parliament. But as Ian McEwan and others have quite rightly said, there is something very, very, very wrong when a mature democracy makes a decision which represents such a radical and abrupt, and in my view, damaging and self-harming departure from our post-war past, and does it against the explicit stated wishes in the ballot box of those who actually have to inhabit that future and have to pay the consequences. That, in my book, is simply, in the long run, unsustainable. So the youth must mobilize and make their voice heard and say that what is happening to our country now is not happening in their name. So I will end with one gloomy message, which is that I think our democratic system is now in greater peril and in greater crisis, certainly than any time in my adult political lifetime. And I believe, if you read the history books, in a greater state of disrepair and dysfunction than at any time in the post-war period. But it doesn't mean it's going to carry on like this. For every action in politics, just as in life, there is always a reaction. And the thing that we must fear more than anything else is passivity, is cynicism, is hopelessness, is a sense of complete disempowerment. It is genuinely in our hands to do something about this. I've sketched out some ways to do it. The parties on the centre and the centre-left need to understand that they need to reach out to each other and not continue to inhabit these silos and glass houses that are doing no one any good in the long run. We must clean up and reform the political system itself, and we must give the young their rightful voice back in the centre of our wonderful country's political life. Thank you very much.